Curl your toes inside your shoe right now. Feel the ceiling above them, the sidewalls pressing in, the small amount of motion that remains. For a living structure that once met rock, soil, slope, heat, cold, and uneven pressure, this is a biologically strange place to spend a lifetime. Foam, rubber, stitching, and a toe box. This is not an anti-shoe confession. It is stranger than that, and less comforting. A shoe can protect the foot from the world, while slowly becoming the world the foot develops inside. It can remove danger, and it can also remove work. Comfort is not neutral. It is a mechanical environment. The foot itself is not a passive platform. It contains 26 bones, 33 joints, and more than 100 muscles, tendons, and ligaments. Its intrinsic muscles help stabilize the arch and modulate load. The foot is less like a chair leg and more like a pressure-reading hand that has been asked to wear a padded mitten all day. But before we blame the room, we need to understand what was living inside it. The shoe is a private, climate-controlled room built around an ancient sensor. That is why ordinary footwear starts to feel unsettling once you look closely. It is no longer just clothing. It is the daily habitat of a body part. The easy argument arrives first, because easy arguments always arrive first. One side treats the shoe as safe modern progress, a clean shell against glass, asphalt, cold floors, and sharp edges. The other side treats the shoe as the reason feet collapse, toes bend, and arches lose their quiet tension. Both arguments feel useful. Both are too clean. This is a courtroom with the wrong defendant. The shoe is not innocent, but it is not acting alone. Footwear is better understood as an environmental pressure, not a moral category. It changes the forces around the foot, and the foot answers those forces through tissue, alignment, and habit. Hallux valgus makes the problem harder to flatten. Constrictive footwear is associated with bunion risk. But genetics, sex, age, joint laxity, metatarsal shape, and occupational loading all matter too. A narrow shoe is not a curse placed on every foot. It is more like a riverbank that can redirect growth once other forces are already pushing. So the question changes. Not are shoes good or evil. Not should the foot be worshipped as primitive machinery. The colder question is how a protective container slowly becomes a pressure system. And once that question is allowed in, the comfort of a simple enemy disappears. Straight sheep is not only anatomy. The Sinky Candon is also a record of pressure, repeated so quietly that it stops feeling like pressure at all. In 1905, at Washington University, Phil Hoffman compared barefoot feet with feet shaped by conventional shoe wearing. The contrast was simple enough to disturb the obvious story. Unshod feet often remained widest across the toes. Shoe-wearing feet narrowed toward the front, with compressed hallux alignment and altered spacing between the toes. For context, the hallux is the big toe. It is not a decorative edge piece. It is part of how the forefoot spreads, grips, and accepts load. When that toe is guided inward for years, the change does not have to arrive as an injury. It can arrive as a new resting arrangement. The forefoot becomes like wet clay, slowly drying inside a mold. The mold does not need to smash the clay, but it's more at. The feekers of the sharing are main and agrees to the trusition if those say we face. And the feekers of the tephinose is the procetal. Futures of the skessage is the big toe. It is not a decorative edge piece. It is part of how the forefoot spreads, grips, and accepts load. When that toe is guided inward for years, the change does not have to arrive as an injury. It can arrive as a new resting arrangement. The forefoot becomes like wet clay, slowly drying inside a mold. The mold does not need to smash the clay. It only needs to hold a preferred boundary long enough for softness to become structure. That is why the historical comparison matters. It does not prove that every shoe produces the same foot. It proves something colder. Different environments can leave different outlines on the same ancient design. From there, the claim becomes measurable. In 2009, a footwear science comparison of habitually barefoot and habitually shod people found wider feet and different dynamic plantar pressure distributions in the barefoot groups. Dynamic plantar pressure distribution means the pattern of force moving under the foot while the person walks. Put more plainly, it is the difference between a foot spreading its weight through a living surface and a foot sending that weight through a shape it has been trained to use. Pause here for a moment, because this is where the story becomes easy to exaggerate. This is not proof of one universal deformity path. It is not proof that every narrow shoe writes the same ending into every toe. The better reading is quieter. Lifetime footwear exposure can leave physical signatures, especially where shape and load meet. If a growing hand spent years in a glove that held the fingers together, the glove would not need to break the hand to teach it a different resting shape. The lesson would be mechanical, not dramatic. And that is the uncomfortable part. The frightening part is not sudden damage. It is slow compliance, repeated until the foot begins to look less like an organ meeting the ground and more like an organ remembering its container. The earlier evidence showed that footwear can leave a visible signature in shape. But shape is only the outer trace. The harder question is mechanical. What changes when the foot does not meet the ground directly, but receives the ground through a layer built by another species of intelligence? In 2010, Lieberman and colleagues published a study in Nature comparing habitually barefoot endurance runners with runners in cushioned shoes. The important finding was not a simple ranking of better and worse. Habitually barefoot endurance runners often landed on the forefoot or midfoot, producing different collision force patterns than many rear foot striking runners in cushioned shoes. Collision force patterns sound abstract, so reduce it to the moment of contact. It is the difference between a message arriving as a sharp knock, a sliding push, or a muffled thud. The ground has not disappeared. The body has simply received. It is a translator between the ground and the nervous system, sometimes helpful, sometimes distorting. It decides which parts of contact become loud, which parts become quiet, and which warnings arrive late. That sounds like protection, and it is. But protection has a side effect. A cushioned sole can reduce immediate harshness, and that matters. It can make hard surfaces tolerable. It can let tired tissue keep moving when bare contact would feel intolerable. But the same layer also edits information. It changes what the nervous system feels, what discomfort warns about, and how the body chooses to land. This is where the argument has to stay disciplined. The Lieberman TAL finding does not mean that all rear foot striking is pathology, and it does not mean that all barefoot running is safe. A foot that has lived inside one mechanical environment cannot be treated as if it had been living inside another. The issue is not moral purity. The issue is calibration. For context, calibration is how a living system learns the weight of the world. If every surface is filtered before it reaches the skin, the foot may still move, but it is moving through edited evidence. So the sole is not merely absorbing the force. It may be rewriting the message before the brain receives it. And once that message changes, the foot is no longer only protected from the ground. It is being taught what the ground is allowed to mean. By this point, the shoe is no longer a neutral object. It has become a working arrangement. Inside that arrangement, part of the foot still works, part of it is shielded, and part of it may slowly forget why it was built. The intrinsic foot muscles help stabilize the arch and manage the response to load. That phrase sounds clinical, but the feeling is ordinary. It is the small, continuous adjustment that happens when weight shifts, when pressure moves forward, when the ground asks the foot to solve a new angle. Think of it as a department inside the body whose workload was outsourced, then quietly recalled. The department was not destroyed. It was simply given less to do. Support eyed from outside, and the old tasks were redistributed without much notice. Minimalist footwear studies report increases in intrinsic muscle size or strength over weeks to months when support is reduced gradually. For context, this is not a miracle switch. It is closer to asking an underused crew to return to a job site, one controlled shift at a time, while the machinery relearns its old rhythm. So, does this mean the answer is to throw the shoes away? No. That would be the childish version of the argument. If old tissue returns overnight, it can fail before it has a chance to rebuild. The arch might be forced to stabilize more, while the forefoot has to spread and bear weight differently. Skin, tendons, and small muscles must interpret surfaces they haven't encountered for years. This isn't liberation, it's a sudden change in workload. And workload isn't ideology, it's the physical stress entering the tissue. A 2019 Nature study on calluses adds a finer detail. Thick calluses can protect people who are habitually barefoot without dulling tactile sensitivity, unlike the effect cushioned shoes have. Simply put, hardened skin acts as a protective layer that still allows the ground to speak. A soft sole can protect as well, but it tends to lower the strength of the message before it reaches the nervous system. This difference is important. Protection and sensory isolation are not the same. One guards the surface while keeping the conversation alive, while the other guards the surface but changes the conversation itself. This explains why the comfort story can become unstable. A foot that is supported isn't necessarily broken. It may be a worker whose colleague has quietly taken on the heavier tasks for years. When that helper disappears, the weakness that shows up isn't a sign of laziness, defect, or failure. It's proof that the job has changed. Let that idea settle for a moment. The discomfort feels more personal here, because the foot isn't just carrying weight, it's carrying a record. Weakness might not be a private flaw, but a physical archive of the environment that once supported you. The ancient foot wasn't designed as a purity symbol or a sacred object waiting for constant exposure to bare earth. It was a variable load organ, built for shifting surfaces, toe spread, gripping, pressure gradients, and sensory correction. In context, this means the foot wasn't made just to stand still. It was built to keep negotiating with a world that rarely repeated itself, step after step. Modern life has changed the terms of that negotiation. Flat floors reduce the variety of surface challenges. Narrow toe boxes limit toe spread. Stiff soles limit bending. Cushioning changes pressure patterns. Predictable surfaces reduce the need for constant adjustment. None of this makes the shoe evil. That would be too simple. A shoe can prevent injury, protect skin, and make hard ground more tolerable. But when the foot spends decades inside that same container, it stops being just protection. It becomes a habitat. And here lies the quieter truth. The tragedy isn't that the foot entered a container, it's that the container became its only terrain. The foot became like a map maker, raised in a room with only one flat floor. It remains a map maker, but its maps grow smaller, flatter, and less prepared for edges. This is the final redefinition. The opposite of modern footwear isn't barefoot purity. The opposite is variability. A foot that meets changing load, changing shape, changing pressure, and changing information is living inside a larger mechanical world. So the weakness was never just weakness. The altered shape was never just vanity. The dulled feedback was never just comfort. The foot didn't simply weaken. It adapted to a smaller world. Comfort can be real protection and still carry a biological price.